Hi, Kelly.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for talking with me. Let me introduce us.
Okay.
I am Philip Menchaca, and you are Kelly Baker, a freelance writer with a PhD in religious studies. And you are the editor of Women in Higher Education and the author of a number of books. The Zombies Are Coming is one of them. The alluringly named The Zombies Are Coming, The Realities of the Zombie Apocalypse in American Culture. You're also the author of Gospel According to the Klan, the KKK's appeal to Protestant America, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And I believe you have a new book out as well, just out,
hmm
Sexism Ed,
hmm
Essays on Gender and Labor in Academia.
Yeah, just this week.
Just this week. Well,
Just this week.
congratulations.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Did I miss anything?
And I have one more, but it's not important, so it's good. I mean, it's fine.
Okay. So, as I said, we're going to talk about your book, Gospel According to the Klan, and go through a little bit about the history of the Klan and how they used religious ideas
Okay.
and its relevance today.
Okay.
Uh, just to start, though, for people who aren't so familiar with the history of the Klan,
Uh-huh.
your book focuses on the Klan of the 1920s, which is when it had its first revival, I believe.
hmm
And so, can you describe the nature of the group during that time?
Sure. So the first Klan happened after the Civil War, right? And we call it the Reconstruction Klan. And they primarily were around to sort of harass um, African Americans and then any white sympathizers, right? And so they had this kind of history of vigilantism, that they were known for kind of roving around and causing problems. And so in the 1920s, or actually it's around 1915, there's a guy, William Simmons, who claims to be a colonel, was a minister, was kicked out, was a fraternal organizer, decides that what America needs is a new Klan. But he doesn't want it to be the kind of Reconstruction Klan like there was before. He wants it to be this like new order with a new identity. And so part of what he does is he doesn't get rid of the white supremacy part, right? Like he wants to keep that.
Just hang on to
But
that.
yeah, like hang on to that. That's an important part. But he does want to add this sort of focus on American nationalism, right? To think about the country as a whole instead of just focusing on the South, and also to make it explicitly a Protestant order, so that he wants to make sure that it's steeped in Christian identity too. Now, the previous Klan was, but this Klan like sort of makes that a key component in a different way, that it's sort of fundamental to everything that they do, that religion and race and nationalism are always together. And so they proved to be pretty popular in the 20s. By 1924, most historians estimate that they had around 4 million members
Hmm.
and that's all over the continental United States, right? So it's not just the South or not just Indiana, right? But they have folks in Oregon and New Jersey, right? Just all over the nation that find this new message of nationalism plus Protestantism really, really appealing.
So this was a centrally organized group, not
Mm-hmm.
just as today it's a bunch of kind of local
Scattered,
chapters,
yeah.
right?
Right. Yeah. No. So today's Klan is very scattered and diffuse. One of the things that the 1920s order had going for it is they had a huge bureaucratic structure. So that they had someone who is at the top, who's their leader, right, which is the imperial wizard. Their lingo is really bizarre. And anyway, and then
Yeah.
they had local chapters, but also state organizations. So it was this huge apparatus to organize people, right? You paid dues, right? You had membership fees. You attended local chapter meetings, right, where they take minutes. So it was a very kind of interesting organization. They had letterhead, which is one of my favorite things to find in the
Oh
archives, right?
wow.
Yeah, and so they very much understood themselves as this like bureaucracy that you kind of had to navigate. But it meant that they could also kind of control their message, and they could sort of present this, and they could bring a whole bunch of people in, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what were some of their goals? They obviously had a specific agenda if they were this organized group.
Yeah, yeah. So they some years they would have planks, right? Like this is what we're for this year, right? And then they would
Uh,
do cartoons so you could kind of see, right? Just in case you missed it. So the preservation of white supremacy was a key goal every year. The protection of white womanhood, right? So this idea that white women were particularly vulnerable, so you had to make sure to protect and defend them. Um, the defense of Protestantism, So that in this moment, what they're really worried about are Catholics, right? So that they
Right.
felt like they had to defend Protestantism in all shapes and forms, right, from this kind of Catholic threat. Um, and then they were always for what they called 100% patriotism. And so I always kind of like this, right? Like it can't be like 90% or 70%, it has to be 100%. So 100% patriotism, which for them was that you sort of support the nation kind of as they imagined it, right? So as a nation of white people, founded by white people, still for white people, right? Like, so it's very much racialized, and also still for Protestants, right? So it's part of that narrative is like who we're supporting are always white Protestants. And that's what we're going to do. And then in other times, they're interested in immigration quite clearly, especially around 1924, where they're organizing to get really strict immigration acts passed, right? And it happens.
Right.
But so they do have different political causes, but it's always kind of like anything that supports white supremacy, anything that supports the nation, and anything that has this particularly Protestant Christian identity, right? And yeah, so they spend a lot of time like trying to think through like what that means, and also like how the Klan can be Protestant, which is an interesting thing that they do too, right? Like how do we make ourselves fit into this like history of Christianity?
Right.
Yeah, and the like mass efforts that they put forth to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think one of the things you talk about in the book is how they tie their identity to uh, a well, I guess it is kind of a reconfiguring of United States history, as the U.S. being founded as this white Christian nation, and
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I tell people all the time that one of the things, as a historian looking at their documents, right, that they are really, really good at selective history. So, like, if you like follow the Klan's narrative of America, indigenous people don't exist until you have wars with them, right? Like, so like white settlers show up, right, and like they're here. And then occasionally you have skirmishes, right? But there's no sort of discussion of original indigenous peoples, right? They're not part of that narrative. That when they get to the Civil War, is it really about slavery, right? Like it's probably about states' rights or something else. And so they keep trying to like do this where they like narrate out everyone that's not a white Protestant, right? Like just kind of like move them out, or they enter into the historical narrative as an enemy, right? Like these are people that we have to defeat in some sort of way. So it's kind of interesting thing where they try to tell Christian history as in like we have Jesus, and then like something happens for a really long time, and they won't say what it is, and then we have Luther, and then we have Protestants, and we have real Christianity again, right? So it's this like attempt to like completely erase Catholics, right, from this history. It's an attempt to erase completely orthodoxy, right, from this history, but just to kind of say like this is what's Christian, right, in some sort of way, and everything else is not, right. But yeah, it's like this wild way that they very carefully like cultivate like this is the story we have to tell, right, about the nation and about Christian history. And everybody else is they're either bit actors or they're like the villain,
the
right, in
villain.
some sort of way. Yeah.
Yeah. So picking up on their treatment of Jesus,
Yeah.
sort
Yeah.
of diving into how they used religious ideas. What role did he play in their worldview?
Yeah. So Jesus, for everyone never believes me when I say that I find this, and I'm like, I have like all these archival documents, right? So, but Jesus was like the model Klansman, right? So that they decide that he's going to be the model of masculinity, right? And the model of sort of how you're supposed to handle yourself in the world. But they kind of instantly run into a couple problems, right? So, for one, Jesus is Jewish. So like what do you like so what do you do with that? And so what they do is they say, well, we know he was Jewish, but we also know that we think Jews are kind of clannish, small c, right? So they stick together in their own ethnic group.
Oh, that's
So
interesting.
like yes, right. So like that's cool. So he would be down with white supremacy because we're just like white people sticking with our own group, right? And you just have to have a moment where you're like, wow, like this is a really complicated way to kind of get to where you want to be, right? So that's the kind of first thing that they do is like we can appreciate his Jewishness, but also, right? Like there's this
Yeah.
other thing.
And we'll get to this, but I think that has a lot of resonance with some of the ideas that are being discussed today about
Yeah.
sticking with your own group.
Uh-huh. Right. Like, and like what, and like who are your allegiances supposed to be to, right? And like, and that sort of tribalism, right? That the Klan is very much sort of advocating in the 20s that definitely has a replay now, right?
Right.
That we have to kind of think about. The other kind of interesting piece that they do with Jesus is they try to claim something like Jesus would have supported the Klan because of white supremacy, because of Christian identity, and that he would somehow be okay with the intolerance that they promote, right? This sort of religious hatred that they're promoting. And again, they kind of have to do these like mental gymnastics to do that, right? To like say that. And some Klan ministers, so there are ministers that are involved in the Klan in the 20s, but there are also ministers who claim the Klan identity, right? And try to do this like Klan theology. Would also say like that Jesus would have been more successful if he had like hidden his identity like Klansmen did. Right? Like, so if he had picked up the robes and hood, like maybe he would have lasted longer than 33 years. And, like, and you're like, okay, I get like, maybe like, I don't know. Like, that's kind of an interesting leap here, right? In
Yeah.
how you're trying to render this. So yeah, so they really did this theology always through the lens of like white supremacy and nationalism, right? Like it's always kind of pushed back together. Like they're never like as clearly separated as we might imagine them to be for them, right? So it's like we're talking about Protestantism, but we're always also talking about like nationalism, right? Or and American exceptionalism too, right? So the U.S. Protestants are the best Protestants compared to Protestants wherever else they are in the globe, right? In some sort of way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this was not. They didn't have any kind of internationalist vision of a global Protestant movement. This was very much
No.
about the U.S.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it's one of those where, I mean, because of the time period that they're in, they're also really nervous about like any international moves, right? So that Klan newspapers over and over again were really critical of the United Nations, right? They wanted no part of this, right? And wanted America to not be involved at all. And, because there's sort of ideas like America is the best nation, right? Where this like kind of Puritan, like city upon a hill, right? An example for everyone else. So why would we worry, like about the rest of the globe in some sort of way, except to say, of course, right? Except to say certain immigrants we prefer because they come from certain countries, right? Like, so the part
Oh,
of internationalism they did was the immigration context, right? Which is like, we're good with English immigrants. We're pretty okay with Swedish immigrants, right? But again, it's the sort of racial hierarchies that they have, right? Where so that when they are looking at immigration, it's particular immigrants, but they're not thinking like that means that we should like join arms with Sweden, right? In some sort of way. That's not what they're doing at all in this moment.
did they seek justification for these racial hierarchies in religious teachings and in the Bible?
Yeah, they do. So they do it in two ways, which is not uncommon for the 20s. Is that they're looking kind of at race science and
Ah,
sort of hierarchies, right, of different peoples that are very popular, where people are circulating these ideas that somehow Anglo-Saxons are at the top, right,
yeah.
and everyone else sort of filters out somewhere else. They add to this a little bit by attaching it to religious identity. So they're like, yeah, so these immigrants might kind of seem white, right? Like the Irish, but they're also Catholic, right? So this is a problem here for them.
Yeah.
And so they do kind of the race science piece of it, but they also look to biblical text for examples of racial separation, right? And
Ah,
so that they look at text about slavery, right? And who should be enslaved, right? That they think a little bit about, where other races might come from, right? From biblical text, right? And how that might play out. So they're doing a little bit of both of those. One of the things to always keep in mind about 1920s Klans, but I would also say sort of white supremacist movements more largely, is that they're really, really good at finding the information that confirms their worldview, right? So if it means you have
Yeah.
to go to biblical text and race science and like meld them together, no problem, right? And you can see that happen in the contemporary period too, right? Where people are like going here for this kind of philosophical movement and here, right, from genetics, right, and here to sort of like cobble it together to make their racial worldview somehow work, right? And the Klan is very good at this, and they don't hesitate, right? So it's not like they think we can't use these together. It's like clearly they work together, right? Like people just try to separate them out, but really, it's pointing us to the same truth in some sort of yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, one of the things you do in your book too is you spend time focusing on material culture and looking at the objects
Uh
and
huh.
analyzing the symbolism of these objects. So I wanted to ask you about one particular example, which was the burning cross, which of course is
Yeah.
probably what comes to people's mind whenever they think of the KKK, because it is such a powerful, evocative
Yeah. Right.
symbol. So what did that mean for
And
them? Yeah.
yeah. So the first thing to note is that the burning cross was not an original Klan artifact from the Reconstruction Klan, right? And it actually came from Simmons, the first Imperial Wizard and founder of the Second Klan, watching Birth of a Nation.
Ah.
So it came from, a book that then became a movie. And he said, like, whoa, like this is really cool that in the movie they like set these crosses on fire to like let people know that clans are all around, right? And it sort of cinematically works in some sort of way. And so he's like, yeah, like this works for us. But he then like puts theology on top of it. So it can't just exist for them. It has to be like a theological object too, and an object lesson. And so what he says is that the burning cross, right? The cross, of course, is a symbol of Christianity, right? Of the sacrifice of Jesus. He's like, but also maybe the burning cross is the light of Jesus that we're sort of permitting in the world, right? Like, so maybe when we set this thing on fire, then Jesus's light glows everywhere. And so this is the kind of interesting part about being a historian where you can say, okay, sure, right? Like, I get what you're doing here, right? But it's very unlikely that victims of the Klan, right, like come out and see like a burning cross in their yard and think, yep, light of Jesus, right? That's exactly what's happening here. So part of it was him trying to like make this a theological argument, but part of it was him also realizing like how terrifying and effective it is, right, to
Yeah.
use that object as an object of terror too. And so you see that a lot with the different objects that they have, that they'll have like a really rich, like theological explanation. But there's also like a really practical, terrifying, right, piece of it too, right? And you can't like have one without the other, right? Either that they're trying to make this kind of seem seamless. And that I think when Simmons did look at the cross, he was like, oh, like Jesus' redemptive love, the light of Jesus. But I also think he knew like this is going to scare people, right, and make people not want to mess with the Klan, right, when they find
Yeah.
this kind of so it's this kind of interesting way in which you have like the clear like religious hatred component, right, attached by the theology always. Like they're just always kind of smashed together in the way that they understand themselves and do these kinds of things.
Right.
Yeah.
It's an interesting rhetorical tactic where it gives you plausible deniability
Right.
because you
Yeah.
have this whole explanation about how it's the light of Jesus and so on,
Right.
and while
Clearly
ignoring.
we cannot be responsible, right? I mean, and that's kind of the way I feel when you work on these movements, is that there's always like their official line, right? Like this is my official line about what we're actually doing. And then you're like, yeah, but there's also like the subterranean piece of this too, right? The like the other like what does this do for us piece,
Right.
and I think it's easy sometimes to say it's only one or it's only the other. And I mean, what I feel more and often is like, no, like these are both working together. Like they have to work together this way, right?
Right.
Either to give cover for those actions, right? Those really practical, terrifying actions, or that really the Klan could imagine, that it can be like a theology of light at the same time that sort of gives you the room to do terrorist acts, right? Like those two work together, right? So
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think it gives people, I mean, not to psychoanalyze too much, but I think it
Right.
gives people um, it makes them feel better about being parts of white supremacist groups
Yeah.
because they can, I think most people don't see themselves as bad people.
Right, right. Yeah.
And they can say, well, no, it's not about terror or hate or anything. It's about my religion.
Right, right.
It's about my
Yeah,
faith.
and the Klan is sort of a master class in this. I mean, like they're so good at being like, well, you just say that we only hate things, right? But we're about love, and let's show you about all the things that we love, right? And let's show
Hmm.
you like what our love of the white race does for us in a certain way. And what it means is like at the same time that they're harassing people, they're giving money to black churches, right? Because they want Protestantism to continue, and they're
Really?
okay with this, right? And you're just like, wait, what? Like, how are you able to do this, right? Or they're trying to build orphanages, right? Or they're like giving money to women whose husbands are killed, right, in the line of Klan action in some sort of way. And so it is this kind of thing where I think they kind of imagined that the goodness of some of the other things that they did, like outweighs some of the other pieces of this, right? And I think it is that kind of thing where when we think about white supremacists, most people imagine them like as inherently like evil or bad people, right? Like
Right.
the only reason this would be appealing to them is that they're just hateful and awful. And I think one of the things I try to do in my book is to show that like these are people that really imagine themselves as decent and good and hardworking and Christian. And wow, right? Like if that is our starting point, like that's a different kind of conversation of engaging them, right? Than being
Yeah.
like, oh no, you're just terrible. And that point that you made, right? Like most of us don't see ourselves as like the villain, right? Right? Like as we're walking around doing things, and they didn't either, right? And so when you try to analyze them just through that, like, oh my gosh, they're terrible, like mode, like you miss the way that they cultivate and the sort of images they cultivate for themselves, but also for the people around them who are going to be like, look, these are good, decent Klansmen. The Klan must be good and decent, right? I
Yeah.
mean, so it very much works together there.
Do you see them in? So, as a bit of explanation, I think, for your book, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you did a lot of archival
Uh-huh.
research, working with a couple of their publications, the Courier and the Nighthawk, I think. Is that right?
Yep. Mhm.
Yeah. In those publications, did you see them ever grappling with how to reconcile the kind of love your neighbor parts of the Bible, the
Yeah.
the positive parts of the Bible?
What's funny about this is that they didn't always dodge that kind of question, right? It wasn't always that they would come at something like that directly. Instead, they would say something like, you know, we're really tolerant and good to people who deserve to have us be tolerant and good to them, right? So part of it is that their definition of neighbor was really narrow, right? So you could be a good neighbor to a white Quaker, right? Or a white Methodist, right? If you happen to be like a white Presbyterian. Um, but the question of whether you extend that to Catholics, right, was just not on the table. And part of that is because like neighbors were inherently like good folks, right? And so they'd already rendered Catholics and Jewish folks at this time period as inherently bad folks, right? And
Yeah.
occasionally you would see something where they would be like, I met somebody who was Jewish the other day. It didn't seem bad, but right, like, and then it was always like the like comma but, right, and then like fill in the other kind of piece of this. And so it was that kind of like a very narrow definition of who gets that extension of a gospel message, right, versus who we're just not gonna play around with, right, in
Yeah.
some sort of way, and that they constantly kind of are grappling with like questions of tolerance because they're so often accused of intolerance, right? And they really want to say like, no, we're tolerant, but tolerance should have boundaries, except their boundaries are like
Very narrow.
narrow boundaries, right? It's definitely not like a universalist, like we should appreciate people, right? Because they're people and we're all a part of that. Is not right. That is not the move they're making at all. Yeah.
So their problem with Catholics was it theological or was it this concern about Rome, about the
So
Pope?
both. Yeah, yeah, no. So they're really nervous about the Pope, right? And this is what I love about them is that they imagine that the Pope has all the power. that if the Pope speaks, Catholics follow, right?
Yeah.
Like this idea that like no matter what the Pope does, like Catholics will follow. So if the Pope said vote for this candidate for president, that Catholics would do this. And it's hilarious to me because we know this isn't how this works, right? Like the Pope can say things and Catholics are like, okay, sure, right? Or some like no, right? Because it's such a big global religion, right? That people again are like selectively choosing how to participate, right, in
Right.
this or some way, or they have fights, right, with like how the leadership of the Catholic Church is handling things. So part of it was that kind of like political threat there, right? Like of like what would happen if all the Catholics were mobilized in the U.S. And I was like, oh man, like you can't mobilize anybody like this, right? Like this just doesn't happen, right? In mass movements. But the other piece of it was a concern about how Catholics understood theology, right? And so again, it is that kind of like that Reformation line of like these are people that are more comfortable with like Wesley and Calvin, right?
Mm.
Than they are the Catholic Church. And so they're nervous about what they imagine are the Catholic focus on actions, right? Or the Catholic need for confession, right? So like the Klan was all worked up in the 20s about like that confession is where things go bad, right? And I always find this a little bit funny because, you know, like when I teach, I would tell like my Catholic students, I'm like, what do you think happens in confession? And they're like, it's really boring, right? Like we have to go through and tell like what's happening. And then the priest tells us what to do. And it's awkward. And, you know, like, but it's not like we're diabolically plotting to overthrow the US, right? In confession, right? That's not what's happening. But it is this way they've kind of imagined it as like, just so threatening, right? That this is where the priest like convinces you to do things. And it's one of those where I'm like, you guys never talked to Catholics, did you? Right? Like you never just like sat down and chatted with them because they sort of created them as these like incredible you know, villains that were always plotting and conspiring and dangerous. And it really kind of shows the way in which we can kind of imagine groups of people to be really, really terrible without ever like interacting with them, right? Like they've
Yeah.
never interacted with these folks. And the same thing happens with Jewish people too, that they do a similar kind of thing, right? Like there's always a conspiracy or there's always plotting or you should always be nervous. And it's like, man, like it's such a small population of the U.S. You're right. Like it just doesn't, like it doesn't work. But it's because of the way they projected those fears, right? Rather than like the kind of interactive piece, right? Like imagine if you sat down and talked to a priest about confession,
What
it'd be a
actually
really
happens?
different kind of thing,
Yeah.
right? But they're not going to because they can't trust them, right? But it is this kind of interesting way in which it's almost always like political and theological, right? Like they're always like the ways in which they're nervous about this, and also the kind of global reach of the Catholic Church and race, right? That you find Catholics, and then so this means they're ignoring Protestants, by the way, like Protestants of color. But you know that they sort of look at Catholics in all these different places, and they're like, oh wow, right? Like there are black and brown Catholics, huh? Right? Like how do we feel about that? And I think it's because of the Catholic Church's unification, right, and structure that they kind of are able to imagine it differently than they do with Protestants of color. But again, it's that kind of race piece too, where it's like, oh, you're like integrated in some kind of way. Like what's happening
Yeah.
here, right? And do we want that to happen? And the answer is like no, right? No, yeah,
This all kind of begs the question. Maybe it's a dumb question, but
yeah,
why Christianity? Why
yeah.
Protestantism?
I know. It is like I think that's such an interesting question, and I think it's because they couldn't imagine anything else, right? Like, so part of it is the sort of way that they told the story of Protestant dominance, right? And the way that they're already kind of involved in church communities and they're already kind of thinking in Protestantism, right? Before they're joining up with the Klan. I think part of this is because Simmons was an ex-Methodist minister, right? And like
Ah,
Christianity is part of how, excuse me, he understood the way the world to work, right? The correct way for the world to work, that really led over. But there was also something about the way that Protestantism, white Protestantism, works so well with white supremacy at this time period, right? That these two just worked really well together. And part of that is because that there are segregated churches, right? And that most of the churches had in the U.S. had a schism over slavery, in the Civil War. We're not that far from that. There's still a deep concern about, the way that these churches have developed, right? Particularly in southern areas where you have like white churches, right, who were very committed to keeping slaves, right, and have a different kind of vision of this. And so part of it is that there was already kind of a partnership there that the Klan was just kind of used to, right? And that it kind of made sense to them. And what I would say too is that in this moment in the 20s, there are liberal Protestants too, right, who are drawn not to the Klan but to the eugenics movement, right? So like white supremacy is a part of white Protestantism in this time period. It just kind of manifests in different ways, often depending on your politics, right? Like that you can kind of find it each way.
Yeah.
So
This kind of leads to the larger question, which, people argue about all the time, but
yeah,
whether there's something about religion that makes it a
yeah.
particularly good vehicle for inspiring bigotry.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's such a complicated question, right? And I always have students who kind of want to imagine that religion is inherently good, right? Like
Yeah.
that religion is what motivates our life, gives our life meaning, right? This is how people help at soup kitchens, right? This is how we march for civil rights, is that we're influenced by this kind of thing. And then they want to say like these people that are using, religion for white supremacy, like this is not real religion. They're bad at it. They're hypocrites, right? Like this sort of like, I mean, I feel like this is the kind of argument that I had like every semester I ever taught anything on the Klan is people are like, how does this happen? Right. And I think, the kind of, it's the nature of religion that it's so malleable, right? Like, and so ambiguous in some ways. Right. But it's always, that kind of like religion turns it up to 11 too because of the cosmic attachment here, right? Like not only are we right about this, like we are like cosmically correct, right? The kind of God on our side movement toward this in some sort of way. And so you find people that use this for like really like excellent progressive right things, right? That they understand that we're all connected and this means like that social justice is a piece of what we do, right? But the other part of that coin is that you find the other people that think that they're right and their rightness is supporting systems of oppression because that's just how the world works, right? Like this kind of understanding that like no, like white supremacy is the order of our world. Like why would you work against it, right? Like this is so, and that they can then claim that it's divinely ordained, right?
Right.
Like that not only is it white supremacy, but this is the way society is supposed to be structured,
This is
right?
the way God set it up.
This is the way God set it up. And the Klan does a lot of that, right? Like where they're like, thank God for the Klan, right? So that their idea is that God gave us the Klan in the 20s, right? And it's like, how do you argue with that? Like, I mean, you don't, right, argue with that in a certain way. Because we've already sort of knocked it up, right? Like
Right.
now you're arguing against God, right? If you're doing this, and so
Yeah.
it's an interesting like problem. And I mean, luckily for me, I'm a historian, so part of me is like, I don't have a ton of skin in the game here, right? Like if I want to understand how they see themselves as Christian or how they're talking about religion, like that's fascinating to me as a scholarly kind of practice. Partially because I want to be like, how do people get involved in these movements and like how do we get them to disengage, right? Or how
Right.
do we get them to sort of do other things, right? And move away from this kind of particular type of activism. But I think it's harder in a theological context, right? Because you're really battling about like, how do we view God and the cosmos, right? And like, how do we understand other people? And that's hard stuff, right? In
And
a way.
it makes it very difficult for someone who, if someone is a true believer, if they have faith or something, and they're being told by a church or minister, or if they find something in the Bible that, tells them to not like this kind of person or do this bad thing or so on, it makes it very difficult to argue against because
Yeah.
they have this faith. It's like, well, even if I don't like it, that's what God wants.
Yeah. Like this
That's
is, I
the
mean,
will
this
of
is the way
God.
it goes. Yeah. Right. And it is, I mean, it is a really like a hard question. I've had people more recently say like, I'm going to this church and we have church members who are now involved in white supremacist movements. And like we're trying to figure out like, how do we handle this? But also have like a question of like, how does the church that we're involved in like support this stuff without us real like what are the like ways in which the support set, right? And like
Yeah.
how do we work against it, right? Or do we just have to leave, right? I mean, and so it's kind of interesting question about what do you do, and like how do you talk back to that, right? When someone says, oh, no, right, this is just the way the world is, like, and we all have our place in it, right? And to be like, oh, huh, right? Like it's a very complicated dance that I think you have to do to like then win people over, right? And maybe you get kicked out of your church, right? Or you like have to pick up and move on, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, there is like a power in that I think sometimes we underplay, right? That people always sort of are like, oh, well, religion is a choice, right? Like
Right.
other identities aren't a choice, religion is a choice. And I'm like, well, that's a really Protestant way to view this. But like also, like people's identities are invested, right? And how they understand themselves are very clearly defined by this. So it's not just like,
It's a
decide
choice.
no, right? Like it's a choice, right? Like, I mean, there's so much more here. Like, do you lose your whole community? Possibly,
Yeah.
right? And like, how do you like then like how do you maneuver in the world? I mean, I think it is a way in which we tend to Americans in particular tend to like underplay, right? The complexity of this. I think other places they're like, no, we get it, right? Like it's because we have
Yeah.
a different understanding of this. But yeah, I think it is that kind of like people are like, I don't understand. Why don't you just don't move on? And it's like, huh, okay, right? Because it's so easy, right? To
Yeah.
just strip an identity off and like move along, right?
And,
But yeah.
and this gets I won't go on my speech about this, but this gets to one of my pet peeves about the way religion is treated in U.S. culture, particularly, where I just think there's deep misunderstandings about the way it actually functions, and I think it
Yeah.
leads to very bad outcomes. And you see this with the way we treat, or many people in the U.S. treat or view Islam.
Uh-huh.
Just very simply, very simplistic view of
Yeah.
what religion is and how it works, and it's just not that easy. It's just
No,
not
it,
that
and
easy.
it's not, and it's like it's one of those where, and when people are like, "This is just simple," that I'm like, "Really? Like, huh? Yeah, really? No." Like, I mean, usually that's my trigger anyway. That I'm like, "Oh no, this is not a simple situation." Like, if somebody's called it that, we like, no, it's not, right? But I think you're right. I mean, it is this way in which we kind of have like almost impoverished imaginations of what religion does,
Yeah, it
right?
exists in a book, and
And then
that's
we're done with it,
yeah,
right? Or you have something like faith and we never kind of define like what that is or what it looks like or what the practice of that might be, or we ask people what they believe in, which is like a terrible way to kind of figure out like what they're actually doing. I mean, so there are all these kinds of ways in which we evaluate religion that, especially when you're evaluating religion of the groups like I study, people are like, oh, no, this is easy. They're bad, right?
they're bad
You know,
Protestants.
they're bad Protestants. They have bad theology. Like, if they had better theology, they wouldn't be here. And I'm like, these guys are theologians. I mean, that's the thing that I kind of do when I present on them is I'm like, I want you to hear the words, right, that they say or write about these, where they're like thinking this through. It's not just like an irrational, like I've decided. Like this is a whole system, right, that they've created that like bolsters a worldview, and that is work, right? And it's a
Yeah,
lot of really complicated work. And I think we have to kind of recognize that better, right? That like I had somebody the other day say, "Oh, well, white supremacists are just irrational." Like, what you need to know, Kelly, because I haven't spent my life studying this, right? Like, what you need to know is that they're just irrational, and I don't understand why you're trying to figure out like the rationale of what they're doing, right? And I was just like, first, I'm not getting in this argument, but like, second, like, there is a rationale to what they're doing, right? There is a logic to this kind of white supremacist ideology, and like, we do ourselves a disservice when we kind of say they're simple, they're backward, they're illogical, they're irrational, because then you miss like, oh, the reason this takes off is like people get this, right? And they
right.
like it and it helps them in some sort of way, and it gives them a way to interpret the world, and like, whoa, like that's much harder to dismantle, right? In the grand scheme of
Yeah,
things than like just kind of dismissing someone as irrational and we can't do anything about it. And I'm like, no, like so much harder than that, right? And that I don't have good answers, right? I mean, people all the time are like, how do we combat this? And I'm like, which piece? Like, what part, are you, talking about? And then they're like, what? And I'm like, I know, like, this is the kind of problem with it, is that it's just a lot, right? To sort of systematically deconstruct, I
right.
think.
So what did bring about the decline of the 1920s Klan? Because they went away, they came back kind of in the
Yeah.
70s, and now we have what's happening today. But
Yeah. So what happened was they were proven to be hypocrites. That's what you gotta love, right? I spend all this time telling my students not to call people hypocrites, and then I'm like, ugh, right, here we go. So there were a number of scandals involving Klan leaders, in which Klan leaders were caught abusing, sexually assaulting, and murdering white women, right? So and these were like prominent Klan leaders who have like newspaper articles about them, right? And one particular Klan leader in Indiana, right? And it was this like tragic case, but then they had a like sensationalized court case around it, right? So it wasn't just him on trial, right? It's also the Klan is on trial, right, as part of this. And that's the part where people start to say like, no thanks, right? Like I was here for the picnics and the marches, right? And the naturalization ceremonies with burning cross. Like none of that was too much, but like the attack of white women takes it a step too far, right? In some sort of way. And so that's part of what happens. The other piece I think that's kind of important to know is that their like style of politics gets adopted into the American political system. So you don't really need the Klan there because you've kind of adopted their rhetoric about nationalism and Protestantism, right? And this sort of 100% patriotism, right? And also their storytelling efforts about like what is America, kind of gets
right,
adopted by the political machinery. And so in a lot of ways, like they cease to exist because of scandals, but they also cease to exist because we don't need them, right? Like their work here is done, in a certain kind of way. I think that's the most disturbing piece, right? Everybody is always like, oh, well, they ended. And I'm like, yeah, but like, look, right? Like their rhetoric is not gone, right? And it makes it hard for me to exist in political campaign seasons because I'm like, oh my God, like, I could print this political speech and then look at like Klan
right,
speeches, right? The 20s, right? And be like, oh wow, like it's the same triggers. It's immigrants, right? We need to defend white women. And like the vocabulary has changed, right? As the times have changed, but like that style and the like pressure points, that they were so good at exploiting are very much still there. So yeah, I mean, it's one of those where people are like, "Don't you want to write about this?" And I'm like, "Do I? Do I really?" Like, I'm like, I feel kind of like a broken record where I'm like, "Look, it's still the Klan, right? Like, ta-da!"
yeah,
And I'm not sure I want to be that person, even though I kind of am, right? I mean, it's one of those where I'm like, I'm not sure I want to do this. At the same time that I'm like, "Yep, that's more Klan logic. Thanks, awesome. That's great."
yeah.
Uh,
There was one part in your book where it was one of the Klan's platforms that they released, and you
yeah,
went through the sort of the 5 goals or whatever it was that they
yeah, right,
had,
yeah,
and I was reading it, and it was very familiar.
yeah. No,
Um,
I mean, it's kind of
yeah, and
wild.
I don't want to read too much into it because there was one thing that was like clean politics, and
Yeah, and
I
you're
mean
like,
who
no,
doesn't
that's not
want
where we
that?
are.
But but
Uh,
it was very much like minus one or two things could have easily
yeah.
been, a
Yeah.
platform that someone would run on today.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's kind of funny thing. I mean, this is the burden of being a historian, I think, is that like, with the 2016 presidential election, everybody's like, white nationalism. We've never heard of white nationalism before. And I'm like quietly at my desk, like banging my head, like against the table because I'm like, really? Like, yes, of course we have, right? It's too far in the past. And so you sort of imagine somehow new again, right? In some sort of way. But it is that kind of interesting thing where I feel like before that election, I had a harder time selling people on why we should sort of be a little bit nervous about
Yeah,
white nationalism. And now people are like, we're listening. And I'm like, now you're listening? Like,
too late.
come on. Like, too late. I know. Part of me is like, okay, thanks for joining the club, right? We appreciate it. But also, like, really now, where you want to be supportive, but also it's kind of that weird thing where I'm like, for a little while, I had a hard time like convincing people that this was important, right? That, especially within the academy. Outside of the academy, I had a little less hard time, but within the academy, there are people who are like, oh yeah, our French group, like they don't matter. Like I don't know why you're spending your time on this and all this. I mean, people are like, I read your book. This is really helpful, and I'm like, like, oh okay, thanks. Like, thank you very much.
Yeah, And
I
this
appreciate
brings us to the alt-right, of course, the
yeah,
so-called
yeah,
alt-right, and
yeah.
the way that they're uh, recycling the rhetoric and ideas that you point out in your book.
And they're good at it, right? I mean,
Yeah,
and so, I mean, one of the things that I think is so interesting and also terrifying about the alt-right is how good they are at repackaging those kind of the Klan rhetoric for the 21st century media landscape, right? So they're doing it, but they're doing it through memes, right? Or they're on Reddit, or they're tweeting, or they are on Facebook, and they're like they're very good at this sort of current social media ecosystem, right? In the way that the Klan was very good at the like print right ecosystem in the 20s, where they're able to sort of maneuver right quickly and effectively, and do that similar thing that we earlier talked about where they have like one message, which is the good decent message,
right.
right, and the sort of subterranean dog whistly message, right, that rests with that then they're like, oh no, like that's not what we're saying, look, this is what we said. And it's like, well, yeah, but that's super coded language for, really racist things, right? So it doesn't work. But they do try to do that kind of disingenuous, like, oh, I was just joking. I wasn't for real.
Hmm.
Not actually being a racist. And I'm like, well, you kind of are, right? I mean, but yeah, it is kind of interesting, like, and that's part of their political maneuvering, right? Is that when people call them on it, they're like, oh, you just don't get the joke, right?
Right.
Or you misunderstood because you're old, or like there's some kind of always like a defensive mechanism there, and yeah, so it's interesting to sort of see them talk, right, and see what they're pulling from, because they are pulling from different kind of strands than the Klan did, right. They're not so much into the sort of American exceptionalism as much as the Klan was, right? That they're really digging authoritarian regimes. I'm not sure how the Klan would have felt about that. I think they would have been like, whoa, wait, right? Like, just a second, because, one of the only things I can say that's nice is they did like support democracy. like it's kind of a nice thing, right? Like, but that's not where a lot of the current white supremacist movement is, right?
Right.
Is that it's a nervousness over democracy and extra voices and deep concerns over multiculturalism and global connectivity, right? In
Yeah.
a different way. Yeah.
One thing I'm curious about is whether the Klan use the kind of distinction between white supremacy and ethno-nationalism, which is
Yeah.
something
Yeah. That's a
that
good
the
question.
alt-right does.
Yeah. No, I mean, so the Klan knew that their ethno nationalism was inherently white supremacist, right? Like, so they didn't see the need to
To
somehow
separate.
like distinguish them, right? Because they're like, we're a white supremacist order, right? Like, I mean, this is part of like their platform. Like, they're like unrepentantly about this. And so I do think it's kind of interesting that the alt right wants to claim, like, well, we are kind of white nationalism, but we're not white supremacists. And I'm like, Richard Spencer wants peaceful genocide. Like, that's kind of like a white supremacist ideal here, right? Like, we can't like maneuver away from that. And so, but it is kind of an interesting rhetorical tool, right? That even someone like David Duke was using in the 90s, right? Where he's like, oh, yeah, like we're a white nationalist movement. We're not a white supremacist movement. And we're like, you just changed the words, right? Like, this is all you did here is you like switch them and they mean the same thing. But that white supremacist is a negative label and you're kind of hoping to get the traction on white nationalists, right?
Right.
And except now that I think for the alt right, I mean, I think there was such backlash to the way in which they tried to just describe white nationalism that now when they say they're white nationalists, people still know that that means white supremacist, right? Like, I think they tried to like separate it and still
Yeah.
do. I just don't think that a larger public is buying it, right? Like, that we're just not here for it in a sort of way.
It's
Um,
it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with the alt-right movement in the next election and the next 2018 and 2020, because it
right.
it does feel in a way that, I mean, they certainly faded from prominence, and it could just be because there's so many other things happening.
Yeah.
Um,
I think they kind of imagined this was going to be their victory lap, and it didn't work out that way for them,
yeah,
right? Like, I mean, I think it's that kind of thing too, where they have this political idealism where if they're like, maybe if we get the candidate that we like in, I mean, we all have this political idealism. It's not just them, right? Maybe if we
sure,
get the candidate we want, right, in office,
everything will be
like
better.
everything will be better and they'll
Yeah,
do the things that we want. And that's like, it's just not how it works, right? That the sort of bureaucracy, right? And the way the governance runs is really complicated, and someone can't just do things. I mean, we have a president right now who tries, right?
Doing his
Thank goodness for
best.
Texas. His
Yeah.
best, but there are checks and balances, right? And
Yeah.
this sort of thing. And so, yeah, I think they kind of imagine like this can be their victory lap, right? That white men were once again going to be in power, which is something that I can't even like say with a straight face. Where I'm like, wait, when were they not? Like, what are you talking about? But they kind of hoped that that would happen. But even like Richard Spencer has decided that because of the pushback he gets on college campuses, like he doesn't want to do this anymore, right? Because he's not able to just kind of go up and give a stump speech, but instead students are like, no, like
Right.
we're not having it, right? Like we're not, you're on our campus, but we're not gonna let you do the thing that you want to do. And so I think it's been harder for them than they kind of thought it would
Good.
be. Yeah, and I'm like, and to me, I'm like, yes, right, like that's what we want it to have happen. And a number of their leaders have been caught in scandals, right? Have criminal charges pressing against them.
Right.
So I feel like there was this like moment where I think they thought they were like on top of the world, and that has kind of faded. I'm a little nervous to entirely say like we don't have
They're
to
gone.
worry about this,
Yeah.
right? Because I mean that's the thing about white supremacist movements, especially post internet, is that like I feel like as soon as you learn how to like combat them in one way, they've already figured out another technology, right, that allow them to do something, right? So like Stormfront is down, but like they still are able to do all these other sorts of things, right? Like so one thing gets shut down, but they're able to sort of maneuver again, right, and find
Right.
a different way to handle it. So yeah, I mean, just because it seems like they fade doesn't mean that they do, right? I mean, which is my kind of Klan stump speech, right? Which is like people keep declaring they've ended and they pop back up like daisies, right? Like we can't like entirely claim that they've ever like officially like ended, because the next thing you know, there's a like a new wave, right,
Yeah.
of this in some sort of way.
New packaging.
Yeah, new packaging, a new style. Though the Klan has declined considerably in the 21st century. So it is one of those things where they can't quite get away from that image of them as like the prototype of racism. Like I
Right.
tell people, I'm like, when you imagine what racism looks like, what do you think? And they're like, hoods, right? Like burning crosses. And I'm like, yeah, so the Klan has a really hard time trying to rebrand this because we're so wedded to that kind of image. And so other white supremacist movements now are sort of filling the vacuum, right, of that. And Southern Poverty Law Center shows us that, there was an increase this year of hate groups, especially in the white supremacist movements. And so it's like, so the alt-right might have seemed to fizzle, but now what other movements, right, are going to kind of pop up
Yeah.
and take their place. Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to wrap up with a question that maybe seems a little bit of a tangent, but
Okay.
I think there's a connection.
Okay. I'll bear with you.
All right. So, was there much like apocalyptic thinking in the Klan? Because I think that is something you see a lot today, both in popular culture and in political speeches.
Yeah. Oh no. Yeah. Yeah.
The world is terrible. Everything's
Done.
awful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, so I went into the Klan research hoping for apocalypticism, because I mean this is one of the other things I'm really interested in is sort of the way Americans are always imagining like the end of the world,
Right.
what is happening here, that we always want to sort of imagine the world has to be completely destroyed before we can like rebuild.
Yeah. It's a religious
Um,
idea. I mean.
yeah, and it's hard coded in a certain way. In kind of American narratives of how we do things, right?
Yeah.
And so I went into the Klan Project thinking like, yeah, there's going to be some apocalypse here. Like I am excited, right? Like I'm going to find this. There's none, right? Like there's just none in the 20s. And I think part of that is it's kind of a prosperous period, right? Right
Mm.
before the Depression. But so I think there's a way in which that kind of thinking just doesn't entirely work for them, right? And what they're doing. But it's very much a part of the current white supremacist, like
Right.
view of the world, right? Like this is irredeemable,
We're
right?
under
Like what we have
siege
right now
vibes.
does not work, right? It is the end times. And I run into people who are not in white supremacist movements, the sort of commonality of this, right? The sort of dumpster fire analogies that we have, like that are continual, right? Which I kind of appreciate. Like so it does sort of sometimes feel like, it is a dumpster fire. But the way in which people reach for that apocalyptic rhetoric is so fascinating to me and also like so troubling. So every time someone does it, I have this moment where I'm like, wait, like what are you actually saying about where we are? Right? Can we not fix things? Because I'm not down for that kind of thinking, right? Like I'm much more in the Rebecca Solnit style of like we have to imagine political action, we have to do the work of political action, and then we get a better future, right? But you don't get to just think that like we're done or it's like that sort of cynicism of like we can't change anything, right, in some sort of way. But it is that kind of fascinating piece, right, where it's just like it's everywhere. And so people I know where I'm like, man, I'm like, you guys have convinced me that I'm an optimist and I'm not happy about this. Like I would not have characterized myself as that. But I'm like, but like part of what gets me going is that students shut down Richard Spencer, right? Like that's a partial win. And there is pushback against political regimes, right, when they try to do these sorts of things. So yeah, it is kind of a fascinating way in which it's like, wow, like we're either like it's okay or like it's apocalyptic. Like I feel like we should have a middle.
A middle
Like,
ground.
is there another option, right, besides this? But again, it is that kind of like historical American phenomenon of like this is the only way we get change, and it's like
And
it's
I do
actually
wonder whether
yeah.
it goes back to, I mean, the U.S. is a very religious country, and that's just a key part of so many religious narratives is um, that destruction and rebirth. Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
and
Um,
that's really seeped into the U.S. consciousness.
yeah, no, and it's fascinating to me. I mean, one of the projects that eventually I'm going to get to is like apocalypticism more generally in American culture.
Yeah.
I'm working on a book right now on zombie apocalypses in particular, and white supremacy and gendered violence and this kind of thing. Um, but I am like tempted to write the like 101 American apocalypses type book, right? Where it's like, here is this example, and here is this example. Oh, and here's another, like this kind of like unending. And oh, I found another example of this
Right.
kind of thing, right? And to think through like what that story does for us, like what does that story do when we tell it and when we imagine it, right? And like what does it give us, right, in some sort of way? And I think it's a really like interesting question about like that has appeal. Why does it have appeal, right? And like and what are the politics we're participating in, right, when we use that kind of story, right? Because I think there is a strand of conservative politics that very much is like, look at how terrible the world is,
Absolutely. Yeah.
right? If we could just get back, right? Like if we could just get back to some sort of weird idealized version of the 1950s, like we would be fine, right? And I'm always like, oh, that's so interesting. Always before civil rights, right? Like fascinating, huh, like startling that that would be where you would sort of move back to. But it is that kind of like interesting piece of that I think we should be analyzing more and sort of be critically conscious of too, right?
Yeah.
Like when you're sharing, narratives with apocalyptic groups, I think you should take a moment, just a moment, right, to think about like what does that mean and should I be doing this, right? Yeah.
Well, I think that's a good place to end. Thanks so much for coming on and talking about this. It's been a fun
Oh,
conversation.
great. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Take care.